Sorry, I couldn't get you.
Yes, I'm just starting the recording. That's what I was saying. So it's just two of us, which is fine. Your camera is upside down for some reason.
Okay, let me. Okay,
Okay,
now
that's
it's
much
working.
better. What time is it there?
It's 8 p.m.
Okay,
I'm from Brazil. You know that, right?
yes. Which part of Brazil are you in?
I'm in the Northeast, Paraíba.
Okay. We were in João Pessoa earlier, late last year in October.
You've been to João Pessoa?
Yeah. We were there. Yeah, we were there in September, late September, early October. And then I was also in Pontes Lacerda and Coiba. I went there like 3 years ago.
It's amazing.
Yeah, so I've been to Brazil twice, and have worked with teachers in different parts of Brazil. Worked with students in the classrooms. I've had looked at the textbooks, looked at the teaching, observed teaching. So quite a bit of work there, and that's part of the reason that I'm critical of the critical approach, because I see that the textbooks in Brazil are very critically oriented, but the language in it's just beyond the students' abilities. And I see that especially when in the rural areas where I was in Pontes Lacerda, it was very common that the teachers would not actually go through the textbooks at all. Instead, they would go through their notes and go through exercises for maths, for example, and science, but they would not actually do the readings. They would skip all the readings. So the students never developed the literacy, even if they could do the basic calculations. So it's always it's any literacy, I think, is about the teacher really. No, not really. I think it's any form of literacy can be okay as long as the teachers are committed, and I think it's the teacher's commitment that matters more than anything else.
I see. It's just a matter of textbooks here. Sometimes it's all about the profit. When a certain company has a contract with the state, it's not about quality. Sometimes it's about a friend of the state that wants some profit.
Yes,
There's so many.
that's true. And in other parts of the world, it's realized in different ways. I've seen it in, for example, I think the practice probably had to stop because they changed the regulations in the Philippines. But for a very long time, the English departments would create their own readers, and essentially would be a collection of readings from different sources, perhaps a few exercises here and there, and they'll be put together into a book format. And then some of the faculty members would publish it and make it the required reading for the department. So, there's a lot of profiteering involved in all of it, and it's like, but I mean, the Brazilian textbooks are quite good actually. I have copies of them, and I use them sometimes to look at examples of how things can be done quite well in some ways. But then what happens in the classroom is not what the textbooks are expecting to happen. So it comes back to the teachers, and I think it's a sort of a good point to sort of think about what we are going to be focusing on today. And I know that a lot of the other people, because of the time zone, will probably watch this as a recording rather than joining us, which is fine. So which is more of a conversation between the two of us. And and then
I don't know if I'm the right person, but okay.
So what we're thinking of doing, what my thoughts are in relation to the joint construction at this point, is that I want to work with you guys together to think of working together to develop a module, or let's say some sort of a competition or an activity that you can use. Hi, Vivian. Hi, Vivian.
Hi, good evening.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm having coffee here.
Evening here.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. That's why we're doing this, because so that it's, it works out for you guys in the Americas, but it doesn't work out for the many of the other participants who are from Southeast Asia or South Asia. So those time zones don't work. So that's why I try to do two different time zones. Anyway, so coming back, so we were just starting, Vivian, as you joined, and I was saying that what we're going to do in this joint construction period is I want to work together with you so that we can develop a set of activities for your students. So wherever you teach, so let's try to put what we've been talking about for the last few weeks into trying to think about how does it actually look like in practice. Right. So the examples that you guys saw so far are essentially from students that worked with me last year, right? So that's part B of the book, and that's what you guys did your credible analysis on. I've received quite a few of them, and I've read a few of them, and I'll reply to them over the week. Uh, but so what you've done so far is you've understood how, for example, the credible is sort of it's a lens. It's a lens through which we can look at other projects and other things and see if they're contextually relevant, if they're trying to bring a benefit, are they ethical, right? So looking at how various projects are designed or developed in order to be credible. Right. And you also did the PDA analysis where you sort of looked at what were the features of the design of material that people developed, which could be understood in terms of how site was being utilized to achieve their goals, how sound was used, how taste was used either directly or metaphorically. Right. So in some cases, it's metaphorical rather than being direct. Especially when it comes to things like videos or flyers or posters, because by their very nature, they're just visual, right? So if it's a poster, it's by its nature, it's just visual. So anything that has to do with sound or taste has to be metaphorically represented through images or through text. So you guys were, you've sort of looked at those things and sort of developed that, and that was part of what we were doing. What we were really in the introductory phases of this course, and also the deconstruction, looking at how it's done, looking at models of it. Now, the models that we saw so far were, in a sense, developed in a very different context for a different purpose for a different set of students. Right, so that's not really what you guys necessarily will do, but you can see how you can engage your students within a classroom context, regardless of what that class is, to sort of create projects which are like that. Right, so that's the kind of goal that we have. But of course, we want it to be more focused. We want to learn how to do it sort of step by step. So in the first step, we saw how other people have done it, and in this step, we are all going to do it together. So the focus, as I've said to you in the email, is fake news. Now, there are multiple reasons why fake news. One is fake news. Focus on fake news itself will be a credible project, right? So it's contextually very relevant. We know, regardless of, there are different ways in which we can look at fake news, but at the current time, for example, fake news that is related to COVID-19 has a huge impact on people's lives and how they act and don't act, and how people are convinced through certain things that they see on the internet usually, or things that they hear. So fake news is very much a concern in the time of COVID-19 as well. But of course, remember, it's not just in COVID-19 that fake news is an issue. It's a general issue, and it's an issue that we want our students and ourselves to be aware of so that we can avoid it. Right. So what we're going to do is we are going to work together to set up an activity where we will help your students develop either posters or videos, depending on what age level your students are at, what sort of technical abilities they have, what resources they have access to. So we can vary that, right? But we want to create an activity where we are going to get your students, in a sense, to create resources in their own ways, where they will then develop something, and you will look at it and you will give them feedback, and then they will improve their designs. And then once you're all happy with the designs, regardless of how many times they have to be improved, once you're all happy with them, then the students can share them on their social media, and you can share them on your social media, right? So in a sense, through that, we are actually going to get your students to design the material that will be then be circulated as ways in which we educate the larger public about an issue of fake news, especially in relation to COVID-19. But it can also be about other issues. In this joint construction activity, we will keep the focus on COVID-19. But if you want to later on, you can definitely adapt it and change it for other things. Now, notice in this course, we actually sort of, I've been planning this for a while, right? So I've already sort of, I put in a lot of questions about fake news in the introductory phase of the course, if you would remember, right? All the 6 questions, we can have a look at them here. I'll show them, I've got them here. I'll share them with you in a second. Yeah, let me just share my screen. Okay, so you can see my screen now, and we look at the phase 1, and we look at the discussion questions. Notice all the discussion questions were essentially about issues of fake news, right? So we will discuss the following questions, blah, blah, blah. Question 1, here's a link to a resource designed to educate people about being able to identify fake news. Have a look at this and respond to the following questions, right? So, you know, if, regardless of whether you actually gave me the questions and typed it or not, by looking at these questions and thinking about these questions as these was part of the introduction, I got you guys to think about fake news in different ways, right? I've looked at different ways of looking at, can you share examples of fake news? Do you see any patterns or features that can be used to identify such news? If so, what are these? Can you share some online or social media resources that are designed to educate people to identify fake news? What are some of the features of this material? And then making it a bit more academic, explore academic literature and research in addition to doing online searches. And then coming into the question number 6, which is what material can you create to make people realize. So we left those as discussion questions in this class, because I didn't want to necessarily push these questions at that point. It was more for us to sort of set up some thinking about fake news, right? But for what we're going to do now in the joint construction phase is sort of come back to this discussion activity, and think about how do we how do we create an activity where we get our students to do something, right? So we want our students to create a poster for fake news. That's their activity. Now, remember the deconstruction, joint construction, and independent construction, that cycle that we've talked about multiple times, and we've got it faced right here as well. So if you see the course material, if you look at the descriptions for each one, you will see phase 1 is introduction, phase 2 is deconstruction, phase 3 is joint construction, and phase 4 is independent construction, right? But this teaching learning cycle is not just something that applies at a mega level, like in the big picture sort of a sense, but it can actually also recur within a teaching learning cycle. So you can, it's a recurring cycle. So in a sense, whenever you get into a new place or a new point, you rebuild that cycle. So for example, now that we are in the joint construction phase, we're going to rebuild that, right? So we're going to do some deconstruction, which is part of what I'm doing. Then we're going to do a joint construction, and then you will do your independent construction later on. So we're going to keep doing that. This is something you will also do with your school students, right? So even though you're setting it up as activity, the activity requires your students to do independent work. Now, the independent work is, for example, a class competition on the best poster design or best video design, which will educate people in their own context, kids like them or adults like them, in their own languages, right? So we're not going to limit a language there. They build that resource, and the best one that wins gets a recognition in the class, right? So you can create that competition where you get the motivation involved. And especially remember, in the times of COVID-19, one of the things is that the students may not always be coming to your classes, right? So they're staying at home. So this is sort of an activity where their parents can sort of work with them as well, right? So you're also, in a sense, by creating this activity and creating this competition, you're actually also going into the households and the families of these kids, because these kids will talk about the competition to their parents, and the parents will talk about fake news. They will have perhaps they might have dinner table conversations around this, and that's great, because you want to encourage that, right? You want people to be aware of the idea of fake news and how to understand it. So notice how, although you're creating an activity for the class, for the students, you're actually working across a larger community. And that's something I think that teachers should always be aware of, that whenever as teachers, we are actually never really only dealing with the students. Each student belongs to a community. They're part of somewhere else, and they're here with us as the students for a certain amount of hours a day or week, but then the rest of the time they're part of their communities. And in this case, especially if you're dealing with online education at the moment, then your students
Yes.
are actually all at homes with their parents. So getting an activity like this, sort of it takes you away from the typical traditional classroom teaching and readings and things. But notice, it's not like you're not getting literacy involved, right? So in fact, you're expanding the understandings of literacy. You're expanding the understanding of what is traditionally maybe called a literature review in an academic setting, right? Because what you're doing is you're getting students to have conversations. You're getting them to look at web designs. You're looking at getting them to do searching the internet, in addition to reading more academic oriented work. So now, in a sense, as a teacher, you realize that you're setting this up as a competition. And I would say, for example, if we're going to do this work in the next 3 weeks, and let's say we designed our work over the next 3 weeks, then I would say that perhaps you should think about this, as something where students, for example, will submit, give the students at least a month's time before they have to submit their designs, right? So the competition takes a whole month, right? Why do we want a month? Because we want to build literacy around it. We know that we already have a school curriculum and textbooks that we have to cover, so we have those limitations. So how do we integrate something additional uh, in a way which is not going to compromise the other stuff that we have to do, but instead of compromising, and in fact, it can further support it and help the kind of goals that we have, because you're getting students to understand that literacy has a purpose, right? You're not just reading texts because it's a textbook, but you're reading something about fake news because you have to create a design, right? So in a sense, what we're trying to show students, and there's some things that we can also be explicit about in our teaching, is how literacy is a tool in order for us to learn about things, where we can do things but with the knowledge, right? So in this case, what they're doing is they're entering a competition and they're developing or designing material, right? In other things, it could be a different kind of a thing, right? Again, remember, this is one activity that we're developing. We're going to do, you can develop furthermore different types of activities with different sort of goals and agendas. But the key idea is, again, the teaching learning cycle. So why a month? Because we're going to include literacy practices and different types of ways of thinking about literacy in that month, right? So the first week of that month could be more of an awareness raising sort of an issue, where teachers, and again, doesn't have to be just you as an individual teacher. You can make it as a class project, or as a whole section project, or even a whole, like, primary school or a secondary school or a high school or a college level sort of a project. It can be done at various levels, right? So you can scale it up or you can scale it down, depending on what your context is, right? And we'll work through those things over time. So uh, the first part would be some sort of a motivational thing, right? Where you're getting your students engaged in the idea of what is fake news, making them aware of how difficult, what fake news is, how it damages them, right? Making them being real, making it very real for them. So rather than thinking of fake news as something that's abstract, think about finding examples of the kind of fake news that your students are exposed to and can be poorly influenced by, and using those examples to create discussions in the classroom, getting them to look at things, making them aware of it, and then giving them a reading, perhaps at the end of that, to a short reading, which if you have an appropriate text that's already out there, fantastic, use it. But if not, you may have to draft something, right? So getting from your own resources, drafting something that is appropriate for your students' level and their age and their expertise and their own literacy. Uh, and you might want to think of giving them various sources. So for example, some students who might be weak in literacy, you might want to give them links to YouTube videos as well. So compensate for that. So in a sense, what we're doing is we're trying to approach literacy in multiple ways, right? So we're giving them visual resources, audio resources, text resources, image resources, right? So for example, let me share this with you. Give me a second. I'm just going to show you something, which I will also send you guys a link of to later on. Uh, so going back to Zoom. Okay, share the screen again. All right, so this is, for example, my students, I got them to do this, and these are some of the, it's on my Facebook, or it's an open page, so anybody can look at it. So these are some of the things that my students, for example, developed. And notice they did it in multiple languages. There's Spanish, there's Chinese, there's English, multiple languages depending on, what the audience was for my students. So in a sense, my students went through the same sort of an activity. So we discussed the questions, we identified things, we did the literature review, we did the readings, and then my students then developed and designed these things. We can have a look at some of them. So for example, let's just look at this one. Right, so it's a short TikTok that they made here. Other students did other sort of work. Now notice, of course, this is the first sort of thing they're doing. They're still learning about PDA. They're learning about Credible, just like you guys are. But notice they're able to apply that understanding to these contexts. Why is it not going back? Oh, okay. Or, let's look at this. This is actually a longer text. So there's actually a YouTube video here. So notice the students actually created a YouTube video, which is again 48 seconds. Okay, so just another example, right? So let me turn this off. Okay. Okay, so you get a sense of what the students developed, right? So in a sense, what we want you to do is we want your students to develop things like that, right? So what we are going to do work together on is creating the resource package and putting the whole activity together. So remember, we've got 4 weeks. So the first week is more of an introduction for the students, getting them to become sensitive to the issue, have the conversations that they need to have. Maybe for an activity, you can ask them to discuss this issue with your parents or siblings or friends, and then come back and report orally in the class about what they talked about, right? It doesn't have to be at that point written down. And then once they report back, then you can give them a reading, and you can do the teaching learning cycle again, right? So you can give them a reading, and you can, depending again on the age group and the expertise, we'll have to vary this. And then you go through the reading with them, explain all the reading to them, and then say, okay, now we're going to, we've learned this text, and you go through that reading, explain all the difficult words, explain the terms, explain the meanings, and then you say, okay, we're going to learn how to write a summary of it, right? And then you teach them how to write a summary. When you write a summary, and why? Because you are deconstructing, you're showing them how a summary is written, right? Give them the summary, and you show them, okay, how do you summarize? What are the features of a summary? What do you do? And then after you've done that, remember, it's the teaching learning cycle again. So you give them another text, right? So this can, again, for example, it doesn't have to happen in one day. It can happen across a few days, right? And you give them another text, and you say, okay, now let's read it again together. You read the whole text together and say, okay, now we're going to write a summary of this together, right? How do we do this? And then you work with them to say, okay, we're going to take this first sentence and this first part, and this is the main idea. We're going to rewrite this main idea in our own language. How can we say it? And then you can have volunteers from your students who will tell you what they can be written. And then you can choose, either ask, depending on if you're in a classroom or you're on a Zoom or what your setup is, you can take up their suggestions and put them into the summary text. And so essentially, working with the students, you jointly construct another summary. And then after you've done that, you have a third text, again about the same issues, and then comparable to the first two, but different again. And you read it again with the students, and this time you ask them to summarize it, right? Notice what you're going through. It's the deconstruction, joint construction, and then the independent construction, even within that little phase that you have, right? So remember, the teaching learning cycle can repeat itself at any point, and any of those stages, especially the joint construction and the deconstruction, it sometimes it doesn't always have to be like you will have one class for this, one class for this, it's 15 minutes or 30 minutes. Sometimes you might realize that you need to spend more time on deconstruction, and then within the deconstruction you will have the teaching learning cycle, getting students to do little activities, discussions, whatever you do, and then before you sort of move them into the joint construction. And then you might realize with the first joint construction that the students actually cannot really, you might realize that you have to put in a lot of effort to create that summary. It's not really coming from the students as much. Now, if that's the case, that's a really good indicator telling you that you should not move to the independent activity yet, because the students are just not ready. Because if they were ready, they would have been able to contribute to the joint construction in the class, right? So in that case, if your students are not giving in a lot of input and you're the one who's leading a lot of this summary writing, even in the joint construction phase, then what it means is that you perhaps have to repeat the joint construction phase until a point where you get the students to be giving you the things that will go into the actual summary. So essentially getting the students to create the text with you, right? Remember, it's a joint construction. Now, why do we want to do that? And why do we want to make sure that the students are all doing the joint construction with us? Because that tells us that they all have the knowledge and the ability and the skills to do it now, right? Because before then, there would have been some students who come from a privileged background who would be able to do it, but other students who did not come from a privileged background would not be able to do it, because there's a difference in the ability and the skills and the knowledge between these two groups of students. But what you have done really just now is, through the deconstruction and the joint construction, and multiple joint constructions if needed, you have made sure that everybody in your class is actually able to achieve the goals of the independence activity, because they have all demonstrated that they can do it within a scaffolded environment, which is essentially what a joint construction is, right? It's the teacher scaffolding and leading the students into jointly constructing a text. So once you have that, once you get to that point, you realize now that the students actually have that ability, which is great, because now they are independent, as opposed to typically what happens, this has been my experience as a student, and sometimes as initially as a teacher as well, is when the students are in the classroom, the teacher teaches, and then the students are given a homework, and the students typically have a lot of errors and mistakes in their homeworks, and the teacher corrects them. And then the student, and the same thing happens again, and the teacher teaches, and the student is given an assignment, and then the assignment comes back, and very often as teachers, you would know, I know, that you get the exact same mistakes repeated again, right? So you get those repetition of the same thing. So what is telling us is that even though we are giving them all this corrective feedback, it's not necessarily leading into the kind of learning we need. So it's the problem here is not with the feedback, although the nature of the feedback can definitely be improved, and we'll talk about that in a bit as well. But the key thing really is that the students are not developing. They haven't actually been able to understand and comprehend and learn how to do it, what you want them to do, right? So they haven't learned it yet. That's why they cannot do it in the independent construction. But notice, if we use the deconstruction and the joint construction and go through multiple layers of joint construction, then you will not get the same problems. The students will not have the same errors again. Yes, they will have problems and mistakes that they will make, but they will be different each time. Why? Because in a sense, they're developing and they're changing and they're shifting, which is good. You want your students' mistakes to be different in each assignment. You don't want the same mistakes every time, because the same mistakes mean not much learning, and different mistakes mean learning is happening, right? And that's what we want to sort of promote. We want that learning to happen. So we go through the teaching learning cycle multiple times. Now, again, if you guys haven't watched Mona's session on YouTube, please do. She talks about the teaching learning cycle in much more detail, and is specifically looking at not just humans, but also how non-human organisms and beings use the teaching learning cycle as well. So you will notice how pretty common it is to sort of do it. It's the natural way in which people engage with learning, especially when it deals with children. But we tend to forget it when we are in higher education or high school or different grade levels. In its formal setting, we tend to forget how it is that people actually learn in a natural environment, right? And in a natural environment, people learn through the teaching learning cycle, deconstruction, joint construction, multiple times before there is independent construction. And for some reason, when it comes to educational context, we forget that, and we develop our own ways of teaching, and textbook-based teaching and assessments, and focusing on literacy of a very particular kind, right, and ignoring other aspects of life and learning. So what we're doing here in this course, in a sense, bringing that knowledge, understanding back into our pedagogy, understanding, for example, the multiple nature of literacies, various different competencies that the students will bring with them, and sort of taking that all on board, but at the same time creating some sort of a shared knowledge and skill set within your school student cohort, so that all of them can succeed in achieving the goal that you have, so that it becomes difficult to identify what's a good, which is the best student, because they're all doing well, which is a good sign, right? So this is actually something, I'll share this with you, but I've had this experience where we have applied this particular sort of pedagogy in certain contexts, and the complaint we got is that we don't know how to mark the students differently anymore, right? So the teachers are having trouble giving differential grades, because all the students are producing good work. So now they can't, have that curve that they want to have in the grades, because everybody is doing stuff now, which is good. I see this complaint as a positive endorsement of what we're doing, because it's taking those students and pushing them forward and making them good. Of course, that means that as teachers, it also becomes a challenge for us to always sort of up our game as well, and build that up. So what we're doing then is developing this activity. You've seen this, in a sense, what we've done in the first sort of phase, by setting up readings and discussions and sharing examples, getting them engaged with all of that. Then building up, once you've got that, then you build up literacy. Then you build up, examples. So, for example, in the third week, what you can do is you can go into this thing here. You can go into my profile, or download these images and these material, and then say, then discuss them, look at a few examples and say, is it a good example, is it a bad example, if you were designing it, how would you change it, right? So use these examples as ways of discussing ideas and helping them generate those ideas, right? Getting them to sort of share their ideas again, because even though it's sort of a competition, it's a collaborative practice, because we're all learning it as well, right? It's a learning activity as well. And remember, it's like, even if your students, some of them will be recognized as the best, but all the others get to be on the internet as well. So in a sense, everybody wins. Nobody is actually losing. Everybody is winning. Now, what do you gain out of it? You get people to become sensitive to fake news. You get your literacy. You get them to do things. You have design. You've got larger in goals of communicating to the larger sort of communities out there. So lots of things are happening, right? So again, it's a slow process. Why? Because we don't want to overwhelm the students. We don't want to overwhelm the teachers. Now, what you can also, of course, do, depending again on your context, you can collaborate with multiple teachers. You can collaborate with, for example, a science teacher, right? So who can talk about the science of COVID-19 and about issues around that. So you can create, now notice how you're now linking something you might be doing in your subject class to some other subject that the students are doing. So by creating that ability, what you're able to do then is something that unfortunately our curriculum doesn't. What we are doing is showing the students how different subjects are interrelated, right? So it's not like what you do in science is different from what you do in English, which is different from what you do in math, and that everything is compartmentalized knowledge, that you learn something in math and you learn something in English and you learn something in science and you learn something in history. And what we're saying is, no, we're not going to work like that. We are integrating everything into this one activity. So in a sense, other teachers are also doing a little bit again, and that distributes the amount of work that you have. So it's not that you have to do all the work. It's distributed across the class, across the various classes, right? So for example, the science, one of the readings that students may have to summarize, maybe even for the independent work, is something that they actually get in a science classroom. It's a reading about COVID-19, which is from a science teacher. Again, age appropriate and genre appropriate. And then the students are asked to write a summary of it. Now, no, notice I'm just giving you these as ideas. I'm not saying do this or do that. I'm just throwing these out as ideas, because what I want us to do is work together to sort of set out this 4 weeks. So what are the, at the end of week 4, the students are going to have the competition where they submit their designs. So in across the 4 weeks, given the context that we are teaching in, or you are teaching as an individual teacher participating in this, what are your students like? What are their sort of needs and issues? How are you going to distribute this time? So what I perhaps would like you to say is just like what I've been doing with you, is sharing an idea of a plan for how I might do it, right? Week 1, I will have discussions, oral activities. Second week, I'll start with some literacy around that topic, and then perhaps integrate it with science teacher, perhaps if I can. And then third week, I will get them into reviewing designs and thinking about designs. And then the fourth week is when they do their own work, right? And they are going to be able to do it. Now, ideally, of course, if within that context, you might even get them to develop some material, not on the goals of the competition, but something else. Because one thing you might have noticed, I'm going to make it explicit now, is when I was saying that your joint construction is text 1 is one, text 2 is another text 3 is another text. That's quite important to remember, that every time you do a deconstruction or a joint construction, you change the focus of the text. So it's a genre might be the same, but the nature of or might will change, because or the content will change, or the focus will change, because you're essentially recreating the same activity at the same level for the students, right? So you're doing the same level activity multiple times together with them, so that they can gradually learn and be scaffolded into that ability. So because each one of you is slightly is going to be teaching in different contexts and different things, I want you to sort of take a bit of time. The three of you, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to turn off my mic, and I want the three of you to talk about what you think you can do in this context, and what you might want to do in developing an activity for your students, right? Talk about, I think the first thing you might want to do is just introduce yourselves to each other, and including what classes do you teach, where you teach, and then sort of think about what it is that you might do. And we'll have a discussion around that, and then we'll come back and have a general discussion. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my mic and my video, so I'm not going to interrupt you at all. But I will listen into what you're saying, and I'll give you guys about 20 minutes, right? So to have this free discussion without my interruptions, and then we'll come back and go from there. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Do you have any questions?
Not so far.
Okay. So, all right. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to stop sharing my camera, and I'm going to mute myself. So the floor is yours for the next 20 minutes.
Okay, so who would like to go first? Lisa and Vivian are here. So I'll go first, guys. Well, my name is Susana. I'm from Brazil, the state of Paraíba, and I live in a small town. I teach English in a public school, and secondary level and high school also. And I'm a little bit confused about how am I supposed to apply this to my students. Why? Because it's not about the fact that I'm teaching in a online mode now because of quarantine and COVID-19 and everything, but because the state kind of determined what I should teach. We have these themes that we need to work each each 2 weeks, and we cannot even teach the specific subject. Like I don't teach linguistic elements of English now. I teach what the state determined me to teach, not just me, all my colleagues. So I'm kind of thinking about that, but it's an issue that I have to deal with it. Maybe later I can talk to Professor Ahmar about that. So that's pretty much it.
Okay. My name is Vivian. I'm from Brazil too. I'm from the Amazon and the north of Brazil. At the moment, I'm teaching English to beginners. So I'm kind of having the same problem as you, not about the content, but about the level they're in. They're still struggling with the English because they're learning, the basic. So I don't know if they're able yet to work with fake news and that kind of stuff. So I still have to, decide and look at the material to see how can I adapt to their level. But about the project, I was thinking about creating something for my Portuguese, for the Portuguese. I recently graduated in Portuguese. So I was teaching Portuguese to refugees. I'm not teaching right now because of the COVID-19, but I was thinking about working with fake news in regard to this subject because there are a lot of misinformation about the refugees and the immigrants here, and a lot of people they don't research about this and they don't know much about it. But there are also the people that want to help, but they don't know how to help within the situation. So I think working with fake news in this scenario would be a good option. I mean, to make the students identify the fake news and then work about what they know, what they don't know, and provide the information and promote the awareness about this issue that is very important here. We have more than 60,000 refugees here in Brazil now, so I think it's something to work on. But yeah, I'm not teaching them right now, so for this scenario I'm working at the moment. I still need to develop.
Vivian, I think the same, you know, there is this problem about the literacy level of my students that I face even when I was teaching them at class, at present, you know, in person. And
Mhm.
I don't know, I'll keep thinking, maybe we can discuss it later
Yeah.
someday, and we can share some ideas. So here in there in Amazon, you're not teaching at all, like not even with Google Classroom?
So we're having many problems about the internet and about the financial conditions of the students. So we're still figuring out how to deal with this. I know it's been like 2 months since everything started, but it's still very difficult to deal with it, especially the institutions, you know, the way they deal with things. So now I've been teaching online for 2 weeks, and the plan is to move on, but we don't have, you know, everything figured out about how is it going to be.
Thank you, Vivian.
You're welcome.
All right, this was quicker than I thought. Lisa, please do, I know notice that you join in late, but do feel free to, introduce yourself and join in. Uh, uh, anyway, so you guys, both of you have sort of raised challenges which we need to consider, and I'm sure that everybody in this program has different sets of problems and different sort of limitations and different sort of areas they're working in. So let's look at each one of your cases one by one. So Susanna, you're sort of one of your main concerns, if I understand it correctly, is that you have very rigid curriculum requirements, uh,
Yes.
and
And my students are not so engaged.
your students are not so engaged. I would perhaps think that that's probably one of the reasons why your students are not engaged. It's the rigidity of the curriculum.
Yes, you are right. They have kind of sued us, the teachers. They were saying that we are wasting their time, but it's something that comes vertically. It's not our choice. The state dictates that. You
But
are right.
in their experience, it is you, right? So even though we understand it's not you, it's in their human experience, it is you as the interface that they
Yeah.
see, and they would blame, and make a whole responsible, which is, of course, we understand that's right, and that's exactly what we are trying to deal with here, right? So you've got a student body who is extremely upset about the current setup because. Uh, Tell me a bit more. I don't want to make any assumptions here. So tell us a bit more about what your current sort of uh, state of things is. So when you're teaching online, given your old curriculum, what are you actually doing? Is it like, are you doing lectures? Are you doing online classrooms? What is it that what you're doing at the moment? How is how is the syllabus or the curriculum different from on-site in a school curriculum or a syllabus from what you have to do now, or is it simply copy and paste into a different mode? So tell us a bit more.
Okay. So first of all, there is this document that we in Brazil need to follow. It called BNCC. It's a common curricular basis for everybody in every level of teaching. So we follow themes, general themes from this document, you know, and monthly, my state, Paraíba, publishes another document that orients us to how to teach it. In the beginning, during April, it was one activity per week, and we were also guided to do short things like make a form, ask a question, ask for a little textual production, something that won't take too much time from the students since they're alone and you're not there to guide them like in the presential classroom. So kind of it. But now we teach one theme for 2 weeks. For example, these past 2 weeks, we thought about human rights. And I know it's an important thing, but the students don't get engaged because, you know, there are these external assessments that they really want to get passed to it, like in name, for example. Oh my gosh, high school students, they are crucifying us, saying that we are wasting their time. They're not going to pass an name. They're not going to be able to enter a college, like it was our fault. So it's, yes, we use Google Classroom. The state paid Google to open Classroom for us. Millions, you know, millions, but it's okay. It's working fine. We don't do online classes yet because we, the teachers, also face problems like not good equipment, not good internet yet. It's so new. We weren't supposed to teach to be online teachers. We weren't trained for that. There are challenges from all over.
So how about doing for your sort of setting? I think because especially because you're sort of also a high school setting, uh, do you think you can maybe work with your grade level teachers or perhaps even the high school coordinator to create sort of a competition, saying that we are going to create this competition, and through a competition get them motivated, maybe even have a prize for it of some kind. In some cases I tell people, it's not always a cash design that we're after, sorry, cash prize that we want. It can be social capital of different types, right? So it can be recognition in the school newsletter, it can be a certificate of some kind that they can use later on. You were saying that they're interested in admissions and things, and in fact I think creating that sort of activity which actually in a sense will help them to achieve those targets, getting those jobs, getting those grades, getting those things, because you're moving them out of the kind of literacy practices that is unable to achieve, help them. So in a sense, through that competition, you're creating an alternative way in which the students can engage with knowledge. You still, and engage with things. Now, notice, for example, in your case, you may not be able to do live classes and things, but this is where you can, for example, have a pre-recorded message, pre-recorded videos, create a YouTube channel with the pre-recorded set lectures and things, but make them more activity-based, right? Where students have to take action. When students have to do things, it's doing engages people. Reading about human rights for a high school kid is not necessarily very engaging, even though we realize it's a very important topic, no questions about it. But again, creating a project around human rights might be more the way around it. So for example, getting your students to connect with, for example, Vivian's students who are in the Amazon and talking about issues of refugees in the Amazon, which is a issue of human right, right? So for example, and again, it's just talking about an activity sort of an orientation, then again, creating the teaching learning cycle around this. For any activity, you'll always have to do that, create the teaching learning cycle, but in a sense, getting the students to develop material that will, may not necessarily have a lot of written language, but are informative videos for refugees, designed interestingly, about various issues that the refugees might have, and posters about it, perhaps, or short videos about it, and then those can be circulated among the groups of people, right? And those are designed by your students, right? So of course, remember, in this case, it's not just about the human rights, but what you motivate the students with is, hey, look, there's a problem. There are so many refugees in Brazil. There's a huge problem happening in Amazon. This is a human rights crisis where I want you guys to do something. Yes, of course, this 2 weeks about that topic is human rights, but let's forget about the reading for a second. Tell me what you guys can do, right? Get them engaged into the activity, and get our kids, especially I think the younger generation children tend to be very humane and very conscientious, and which is something we adults lose as part of growing up, unfortunately. But I think with the students, definitely getting them engaged with saying you can do something to help these people, right? Getting them motivated on doing something to help somebody else, right? That motivation, in a sense, is also really good, because it also encourages cooperation and collaboration versus a competition, right? Notice again that traditionally education is designed on a philosophy of competition, right? It's always all competition, and that's why I'm saying set up a competition. But notice in the competition we are setting up, our goal is collaboration and cooperation, and we are actually,
yeah, I know,
right? So shifting the parts of that. But you can, for example, do that sort of a competition and then create those resources, getting them engaged. Hey, let's do something about an issue. I mean, the reason we're doing the fake news is because, in a sense, we'll control it to learn ourselves. But in your own context, you might in your own independent work for your own projects, you can do something different. You can plan. So, for example, saying that, okay, when I'm doing my independent work, it's going to be, say, let's say in August or September, whenever it might be, and then the government will have these requirements that I have to meet those weeks, or that month I have to do this topic in this month, or something, and then I'll plan something focusing on that timeline and that particular topic. So as part of it, your independent work, you can focus more in terms of your actual teaching. So if your state is giving you a new topic every 2 weeks, then if we learn how to create these sort of activity based teaching, sort of integrating all various skills and literacy practices, then you can do that for each 2 weeks. So every time you have a 2-week cycle, you create a little introduction and deconstruction in the first 2 days of the, then have a bit of a deconstruction, and then into week 2 you have a bit of joint construction, and then you have the independent construction. So within the 2 weeks, you can introduce that cycle, and that, notice at the end of the 2 weeks, the students are producing something, which is something action based. So they're producing something, right? But then the reading and things are still part of it. Sorry, I'm going to, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Suzanne.
Now, I just have a question about the time issue. For example, the next 2 weeks, the theme is social media, really appropriate for this theme that we are discussing now, fake news. But the thing is, each teacher has only one activity, one day to send the activity to the students. And then we wait 4 days, they send them back, we correct them and grade them. So time is an issue now, because I just have 2 encounters with them, and would that be enough?
May or may not. I think it depends on how you utilize them. Again, you will have to experiment with this. I'm not familiar with the context or the students and things at all, but I think you can. I don't see why you cannot sort of, even if you're just meeting them once. So you're only going to have 1 hour with them on the topic. That's it.
No, actually, I have 1 hour to post the activity, but during the week they can contact me in my WhatsApp or in my Instagram. It's free. I'm really open to them.
Okay.
They can contact with me.
All right. So
if I get them engaged.
Okay, good. So do you have you have a WhatsApp group for your class?
Yes.
Okay.
Probably.
So maybe that's where you do a lot of this work. Then is through the WhatsApp group, right? So using the WhatsApp group. Do you have WhatsApp group for the school as well, or for the high school as well as like different, like sets of WhatsApp, or is it just more as an individual teacher's sort of choice?
Yeah, it's an individual thing because not all my colleagues of mine agree in saying, letting their WhatsApp for everybody.
Yeah, I understand. And sometimes for good reasons too. You know, I mean, yeah, absolutely. But if in your case you do have that, so that's a great sort of a resource you already have.
Yes.
So then, let's say fake news, social media. This is it, right? So today is also Tuesday, right? So you've sort of just started the topic.
Oh, it's for next week. It
Okay, so
starts next week.
it's next week.
I have
So
some time yet.
fantastic. This is, let's do it. You can be our joint construction and doer. So for the next 2 weeks, let's plan it. So let's say let's do it with you. That's for the next 2 weeks, starting next Monday, you will be focusing on the social media. And of course, one
Yes.
aspect of social media is fake news. Uh,
Yes.
okay, so why don't we say that your students, let's create that activity. Get the students to say, okay, this time, this for these 2 weeks, I'm not going to focus on the, traditionally what I do. Instead, in this hour that I have with you, I'm going to set up this activity for you guys. So your goal is to do this, and in order to do this, I've given you these resources. So create the resources, maybe a link to various YouTube pages, various YouTube videos, readings perhaps. So you have a range of things as a resource package. So you can create a resource package. And essentially in that 1 hour, you introduce the activity, you introduce the say so-called competition, tell them that perhaps as a first time around, maybe you can do it as a group project, so they're actually engaging with each other as well. And tell them that step one, they need to talk to each other and talk to their parents about this. That's the first step. And then after they've done it, they can post a short audio summary on WhatsApp for the group, right, as an update activity, which you can sort of set up a timeline, right, and then say, okay, then the next timeline, have a look at these resources, send them the links, which one you think is the most effective or the least effective, have why those are, and then again, and the third one, what are your ideas, and then they have to sort of create it. Now, of course, you're sort of giving them in the resource packet readings and things as well, and that's where you do some of the scaffolding is done online, offline through WhatsApp and YouTube and other things, right? And then the students' activities are oral mostly, and instead of reading based and writing based. So let's see if we can try to change their motivation a bit. And you can say that you're going to set up this as a competition. So at the end of 2 weeks, the students all have to submit their designs, and then the first top 3 will be given some sort of a recognition. You will have to decide what is appropriate. Again, it doesn't have to be monetary; it can be social capital of different kinds. But you can sort of see how you can, again, the kind of students you have, how you might want to generate interest, how might you want to get them motivated to get this competition, get them hyped up out of the competition. It's a competition that's going to drive them. And unfortunately, because the way of nature of education is so competitive, they will sort of hopefully come into it, especially if there's some sort of a thing for them at the end of it. uh, let's see if we can do it. And in your case, it's not a 4-week deadline. You have a 2-week setup, right?
Yeah.
So let's work with you and say, if you want to, we will work all together in a sense. If you want to sort of take a couple of days and design what you will do over the next 2 weeks in terms of what resources are available to you within your own context. So what might you want to do in your Google Classroom? What will you do through the WhatsApp? What timeline will you set up? What sort of resources will you provide them for various steps? So if you want to create a sort of an outline around the ways that we're thinking for a 2-week period, right? With where the students are going to submit something, then what would it look like? So let's plan your next 2 weeks focusing on social media, within social media, focusing on fake news, right? And let's see that we will achieve, let's try to achieve both your curriculum goals, but
Yeah.
at the same time, more than just those goals, giving them those skills and things that we can. Aisha, we just noticed that you joined too. So, just, yeah, introduce yourself in a bit. Yeah, sorry, yes, Susanna, go ahead.
Okay. So at this point, is there anything that we should write?
I think just if you can draft something like like an outline of what you will do for a 2 week period with a goal, steps, strategies, resources. It's not a formal piece of writing, but sort of a map for yourself. And then maybe if you can send that to me initially, I will work with you. And then once we have a working draft, we can share it with the rest of the participants, and maybe they can give you feedback as well. And that's fantastic, because that's, in a sense, it's the joint construction. We're all going to work together, and hopefully, as I said, maybe, and I want you to sort of think about it in your own context. You were saying Portuguese, absolutely, and you were also saying that you work with the students who are beginner English students. So of course, their language proficiency is very limited, as you said. And in that context, I would think that you should actually set up a competition or something in Portuguese instead of English, and use English as teaching. Use the competition itself is in Portuguese, but you use English and teach them about the same terms and the same concepts. So they're reading in Portuguese about certain things, but you're talking to them about the same things in English. So they're starting to map things on, right? So the meanings are sort of converging, in sense of they're starting to see how Portuguese meanings are created and how you say similar things in English. So in a sense, working at that level with them, using Portuguese as a resource. I say this to teachers everywhere all the time: use students' local languages as a resource as much as you need. Because when we're dealing with students' second language learning, we're not really doing learning. The term second language acquisition is a misnomer. It's one of those terms that is extremely problematic, because when you use the word acquisition, it gives you the sense that you're acquiring something you don't have. But notice, with second language learners, that's never the case. They already have language. So they're not acquiring a language. They already have language. What they're learning is another set of ways in which to express meanings that they can already produce, and expand those resources, because of course each language has its own windows and window into looking at the world. So of course you expand those, but it's essentially, in the context of second language students, what we have is second language development, which is it's a development of their language, right? So it's not an acquisition of language. Whereas in case of, even in case of children, they're not really acquiring a language, because they have already understood symbolic systems operating in other contexts. So they're adding and they're developing their use of symbolic systems in the context of language, and then in literacy, and then being able to express the same meanings through what we can consider different languages, right? So it's a developmental sort of a way. So think of it as development, and it's gradual, and it builds on what the students already have, right? So in their context, the students have literacy in Portuguese. They have they have the language, right? So what you're trying to do is help them develop their ability to say the same things through English. So in that context, actually using Portuguese, even if, especially with the beginners, even their end product can be in Portuguese. It doesn't need to be in English, right? But English is part of the pedagogy itself. It's through your engagement with them and explaining things to them in English, using phrases multiple times and modeling English and explaining all of it. You're sort of slowly giving them the ability, and that's something that you might slowly shift. So that, right, with the very beginner students, you can, the final activity, for example, in the case of fake news, can be in Portuguese. I don't know if you guys noticed, but in the examples that I shared, there was examples from Spanish and Chinese, right? Because that's their language. That's what they have to work in. Which is fine, but then English is your language of the instruction. It's the medium of what you're talking about. It's the teachers, and gradually over time you can make it bilingual, so that the next set of activities, the students actually produce bilingual texts, and then gradually shift over to English, which is a developmental sort of a strategy, right? As opposed to forcing them into English throughout, which is another problem, because they're not ready for it. And because remember, independent. Sorry, go ahead.
They wouldn't like it either. If I talk too much in English in my classes, they're like, "You boring teacher."
Yeah.
They would say it to my face.
Yeah. Yeah, and so therefore use it as a resource, and again, getting them engaged in activities, especially uh, making them do things, because kids have a lot of energy, right? I mean, it doesn't matter which level you're teaching, but they all have tons of energy. And you know, in a I mean, in classroom setting, we know that the kids are always fidgeting, they're always moving, they're doing things, and you know, of course, we have to discipline them, right? But notice what's going on. Naturally, that's not what kids are like, you know, and especially now that they're not in a classroom setting, they don't have those disciplinary boundaries anymore. So making them act, making your classrooms and your online classrooms be like a real classroom is not going to work, because those disciplinary and contextual things that, you know, enable a student to focus in a certain way are no longer available, right? So there is no behavioral sort of mechanisms that you can operate through, which you can in a real classroom. So therefore, you know, because of that, you really have to think more into students and your learners. So whoever your learners are, your students are, their age and their sort of, you know, their kind of being at where they are, right? So if you're dealing with high school students, you have to consider that, you know, the kind of life that a high school student has, the kind of thoughts they have, the kind of things they do, and you have to sort of align your own teaching with them. Because in a classroom, in a real classroom, you know, they're forced into doing things your way because they have no choice. But now they don't. So if you know, and so if you expect them to be able to do this, what they were doing in a real classroom, you know, you're not going to necessarily succeed, because they won't act the same way, they won't, you know, engage the same way. So in a sense, that's where, you know, I don't know how much of the government sort of stuff that's coming to you takes this on board, but you really have to change the very nature of what you're doing. You have to align it with where the students are and who your students are and what their interests are and what their hobbies are and what the sort of things get them engaged and what things don't get them engaged. And you have to use all of that in order to influence their behavior. Yeah. Um, I'm going to pause here. Any questions, Susanna, Vivian? Yeah.
I
I
have
have
I
a
have a question.
Sure.
I'm sorry, Vivian.
Okay, let's go Vivian and then Susanna. Vivian, go on.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's very interesting to think about development, because the process of learning is personal, right? So they have a lot of things that they want to say, and then we're there to help them. And you were talking about adapting, and then I remember the last sessions that you talked about the five senses in relation to the credible project. And personally, I have a difficulty to adapt all the five sentences or some of them to adults, because I think one of your examples was about cooking, you know, making in how can I say, motivating the kids to cook and work with the materials, etc. But I don't know, I don't have this ability yet to motivate the adults to do the same thing. So I'm asking you some tips, or how do you work with this for adults and not kids?
You have to do exactly the same thing. You have to think about who those adults are, where they are, what sort of, you know, because adults are, of course, all different, right? They're not all the same. So you have to always think about who those people are that you're going to work with. Where are they based? What is the circumstances? You know, where are they living? What is the situation? Now, think about this, the five senses here in a sense, which is fantastic. This is actually where I wanted to go to. So I'm going to pause here, Vivian, I'm not answering your question, but actually my sort of concluding note is actually tied into what your question is. So I will answer it in a second again. All right. So I'm going to go back to Susanna and then answer her question, and then we'll come back to yours.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. So my question is, I teach 10 groups of students, and they're all so different from each other, but they're multiple ages. And sometimes I have a teacher from the first year of secondary school, and that is the same age of a student from high school. And I was thinking, and of course, there are some students more motivated than others. So my question is, can I select a limited number of students from different levels, like 10 students? like the most motivated ones that are responding actually responding the activities?
So our goal, of course, in this case, Susanna, is to actually motivate the students that are not being motivated, because we have to get them
Oh.
involved. So I mean, for this particular joint project, I think let's keep it specific to perhaps just one cohort, just because we are trying it out, right? So once you sort of learn through it, maybe you can expand and experiment more.
One level?
Yeah, just one level, and perhaps a higher level, just because we're learning to do it, and it might be easier for us to work
Okay.
through it.
Okay.
And then later on, of course, we can talk about adapting it. But for a joint construction, it might be easier if it's a bit, but bit more older kids as opposed to younger, and a bit more
Okay.
advanced as opposed to not. But again, we'll have to vary it and come back to it. So, any other questions, Susanna?
No. Thank you.
Aisha, Lisa, do you want to say something? If you please do, if you would like to.
I'm sorry, I didn't get you.
No, I'm just saying to Lisa and Aisha if they want to say hello or introduce themselves. No force, no compulsion. Okay. Anyway, so coming back then to Vivian, your concerns and your questions, and I think they're really very relevant to our discussions so far. And let me sort of rethink, let me talk about the five senses again in a slightly different way. So far, we've been looking at five senses through looking at positive discourse analysis, and talking about how we use, visual senses or audio senses or taste, touch, and smell through metaphors, right, in various contexts, in terms of production of material or in terms of evaluating or understanding a material, which is good, which is fine for what we've been doing with it. But what you have raised is a way sort of where is a question where we need to rethink those five senses from a different perspective. Now, this is something I often tell my students as well. Now, in the context of education, our job as educators is, in a sense, to to sort of influence our students' behaviors and practices, right? Of course, that comes through. There's of course the question of knowledge and material as well, but there's also this whole set of things that we have to do as teachers. Now, if when you say that your students are not motivated, or you say that your students have these issues and these problems, let's review them and think about them in terms of these five sensory systems, right? So our students are real beings, human beings, who have the sensory systems that they have. Not everybody will have five senses. Not everybody will use it the same way or engage with them the same way. They're all going to be different. But it is that is their existence. So they live through their sensory systems in their present time, with their own understandings of the world and their beliefs and their practices. And it is because of those beliefs that they act in certain ways. So for example, they are not engaged with your activities or something. Right. Now, typically in an educational context, education is very literacy heavy, right? So essentially everything that we do in a traditional education is literacy based, whether it's in terms of reading or assessment. It's all reading, writing. Oral language is not actually part of the evaluation criteria typically, right? So then it escapes it. So education typically in a standard setting is always literacy based. Now think about this. Literacy is one aspect of sight. Now, why is it that we would think that through this one aspect of one sensory system, we can influence our students' behaviors and practices? Right? So we are just engaged in one little dimension of their existence, which is not immediate to their context, especially in the time of COVID, but even when it's not. It's often not in their immediate context. Why is it that that kind of literacy which is visual, which is outside the context, outside the realm of experience and understanding. So I was talking to one of the other course participants the other day, who's from Thailand, and we were looking at the textbooks that she has to use in Thailand, and we were looking through the table of content, and we were looking at how pretty much everything in the textbook has no relevance to the students in Thailand. Right? So nothing in that textbook is about their experience of life. So what you notice then is through that, in the typical education, you've got this visual text-based system, which is then abstracted out of the students' experiential realities. So there is nothing connecting that visual text or syllabus or curriculum or the textbooks that we, or things that we do, to a student's reality or existence. Then if that is the case, and our educational practices do not consider the material existence of our students, then we are disaligned. There is no alignment between the two. And if there is no alignment within our ways of thinking about education and students' behavior and literacy engaged with everything else, and our only focus is on the reading and the writing, then if people can learn to read and write, but other aspects of their lives will not change at all. Right? Because the reading and writing is distant and abstract and remote. It is nothing that is embedded within your own experiential lives. And that is essentially what we are trying to change through this, right? And this is why we're trying to, as we think about motivating our students and creating these activities, we're thinking about these 5 senses. Where are these students going to be? You know, what sort of environment do they live in? Where are they physically based, right? If that determines to a large extent what they can do and not do, or what they will do, or what you can get them to do, or what you cannot get them to do, right? Because that where they are, that's their material existence. So if you want to influence their behavior and beliefs, then you have to engage with them with an understanding of all those 5 sensory systems. So you have to create those activities which are embodied, and where you design those activities where students get a sense of all of those things, right? So, for example, one of the things that I often talk about in talk of fake news is trying to think about it in terms of just taste, right, and smell. So I say to people, imagine this. Imagine that there is a dish in front of you, and you look at it and it's green and it's moldy and it looks like it's old and it smells really bad. Now, just saying this to you guys, even though I'm not saying this to you, I'm narrating an experience that I have, but just hearing that is going to make you feel disgusted. Food that is disgusting, it looks bad, it smells bad, right? So as a person listening to this, even though you don't have that food in front of you, through a description of it, I am connecting to your senses. Right, and I'm saying, look, imagine there's a food in front of you. Now, imagine this is horrible looking, and it's ugly, and it smells bad. And then I'll ask them this question: will you eat it? And of course, they all say no. And then I say, okay, now I'm going to show you a slide or show you a video, and in this video, I'm going to show you the same food, but I'm going to tell you how good it is. Now, simply because you're seeing and somebody is telling you how good it is, will you eat it now? Right? No, you still don't eat it because it's still disgusting, because it's physically in present of you, regardless of what somebody is telling you. Right? Even if somebody is telling you it's amazing, it's delicious, you're not going to eat it. Right? Because you personally don't want it, you disagree with it, you don't like it, it's disgusting, it smells bad. Now, that's fake news. Right? The idea that, in a sense, people, what's in front of you, what's real, is observable. It's within your sense of observable. When people are saying things which give you an opinion, their opinions about certain things, we have to remember that it's an opinion. It is not the thing itself. And right, so in a sense, notice in our conversation about fake news, we bring in these other sensory systems, right? That's how we sort of, in many contexts, that's how we sort of integrate smell and touch and food and taste into 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 a sort of a discursive oral interaction, right? Essentially using metaphors, using our understanding that people are going to, you can get people to imagine things, right? And use that, right? So getting people to use that imagination in order to understand and appreciate or think about what you're doing, right? It's not unlike, in a sense, what sort of thing, some of my own experimentation that I'm doing with my writing. So for example, just my background that you guys are seeing, right? Remember, we have talked about it. It's part 3 of the Boli, and just getting you to read the essay in relation to the image, right? So breaking you away from your traditional sort of ways of evaluating things and shifting that evaluative framework by creating a different link to a different image, right? So creating the alternative ways through in it. How? Through engaging through all those 5 senses, keeping those going through your discourse, through your engagement, getting students to feel things. Reading does not make feel things necessarily. Of course, you can read a poem and it can be very moving. But really, reading about human rights in an encyclopedia or a description of human rights is really boring, right? It's not the sort of stuff that most people want to do. But of course, if they're engaged in human rights, then they will read it, because the reading is information for an act. Reading is not the act itself. And remember, that's something that I've been talking about again and again. What we are doing is shifting. We're not saying that literacy is not important, but let's not make literacy the goal. Let's not make the reading and the writing the focus of everything that they do. Make reading and writing supportive tools in order to do something else, right? The doing is what will motivate the students, because again, it's the energy and the engagement. Now, how you do that, it's going to be varied, because if you teach younger, older, all those things, highly proficient, less proficient, all those things, will make a difference. Whether they're refugees will make a difference. Everything will make a difference. But so you'll have to sort of think those through, and that's part of individuating all these sort of plans. But keeping that in mind, that in your engagement with your students, make sure that you connect with them at that really physical level, in the physicality of touch or food or smells or even sounds, right? Sounds can do a lot of things, but really engaging through those things and not depending purely on text, because text will not enable your students, especially when they are not even in a classroom. So I hope that Vivian sort of comes back and sort of answers your question in how we see these 5 senses. It's not simply just about looking at designing. It is, of course, we use the credible and PDA both for analysis and also for designing, right? So for now, so far you guys have only been using it for analyzing and reviewing things, right? But as we move into the joint construction, and especially towards the independent construction phases, we will start transforming it into using those as design tools. So instead of using credible, in addition to using credible and PDA as tools for analysis, you can actually use credible and PDA as tools for designing. So essentially what you do is you reverse the tables and you look at how you are going to use various, visual, sound, taste, touch, whether directly or metaphorically. How will you use them? What will you use? And for what meanings do you want to project through that use? Right, so that we can look at it in a sort of holistic sort of a sense of how you're going to either use the various sensory systems directly, or metaphorically. So, for example, one of my students in Sydney this semester, she's developing, she's actually already sort of implementing this to a degree, a class where she's getting, she's teaching remotely online, and she's actually developed a lesson for her English students where she is getting them to, to cook, make food together with her. So, of course, it's not dangerous stuff, right? So it's like even putting some sort of a sandwich together from a particular part of the world, and then talk about different kinds of bread, talks about different kind of sandwiches, talk about different kinds of foods, and then the students have to bring the material from the kitchen, they have to do it, and then they eat and they sort of participate, right? Notice that's engagement. So the students are doing things while they're talking about it, and then the teacher is adding literacy around it. So reading about different types of foods from different parts of the world, reading about different types of ingredients, talking about the health benefits or harms of different ingredients. And that's where you can, again, integrate other subject matters into your sort of focus, right? Especially with food, bringing that in. So imagine you can actually create an activity where the students are actually cooking food and doing that stuff along with you. And then you build those literacies and things, and you get them to create another, after you've done the deconstruction and created the food, they make the food, and then they do cook something different, perhaps with their parents. Their assignment might include things like talk to the person who does most of the cooking at home, whether it's your a mom, dad, grandma, whoever it is. Talk to them about one of their favorite recipes from their childhood, and write down that recipe and make the dish with your grandfather or with your mother. So notice here, you're getting them engaged, you're getting them to write the recipe, you're getting the children to talk to the parents about food, about health, about parents' own growing up, right? Connecting why, the reason why you wanted to be a childhood food is because you connect the children with their parents' childhood. You create these bonds. So, again, in a sense, these are all your sort of ways of thinking around these things and how you create engagement and activities, which will vary based on who you are, where you are, what your own skills are, what your own expertise is. So it's like, if you're not good at cooking, you don't want to do a cooking thing, right? But if cooking is your thing, you go for it, right? So different people will have different sort of skills, to do it. You can create drama through it. You can create fiction. You can get people to write songs as activity. So instead of, depending again on where you're teaching, what their students' skills are, you can get them to write poems, songs. They can perform songs, even though they're remote. They can collaborate through Zoom and do a recording of some kind. Think about them in terms of various forms of activities that your high school kids would want to do anyway, right? So aligning it together so that they see, then remember, again, going back, that what we want them to learn is that literacy is a tool that they can access and use in order to achieve goals. It is not the end itself, right? And if you change that orientation, that the students' use of literacy becomes stronger. And if the students know how to use literacy, then you have done your job. Because remember, one of the things that we talked about earlier on in the semester, not the semester, in the course, and this is the last thing I'll talk about before we end, is that we differentiated between things in the world that are finite and things that are infinite, right? So things that are infinite are things like money, knowledge, wealth. These things are infinite. You can never have all the money because there's more of it. You can never have all of knowledge. There's more of it, right? So there are things in the world that are infinite, and then there are things in the world that are finite. Now, the way I like to see it, and the way I like to encourage my students and colleagues to think about it, is that anything that is in that group of infinite should not be our goal. Should never be our goal. Because anything that is infinite, if you make it a goal, then you're setting yourself to an unachievable goal. Why? Because it's infinite. You can never achieve it, right? So if your goal is something that is in the infinite set, then there's a problem, right? Unfortunately, our educational systems are currently set up for that. Knowledge is the goal. That is unfortunate because knowledge is infinite. Nobody can ever possess it, all of it. Therefore, to make knowledge the goal of education is highly problematic, and therefore something that I don't support and I don't encourage you to support. Instead of that, we can think of anything that is in the set of infinite as a resource. So it's a resource that we use in order to achieve a goal within our finite, which is our living conditions, our very existence of where we are, our health care, our hygiene, our welfare. That's important. That's our existence. That's where we are as individuals. That's where our application is. And anything that is infinite is a resource. So you use knowledge, you use money, you use anything that's in the infinite in order to achieve the finite, to help with the finite, right? To support the finite. But if you make the infinite your own goal, which is what the educational systems do, you're essentially chasing a goal that is never achievable. So you will keep on going, trying to claim and getting more and more and more and more knowledge, but without having any understanding of how that knowledge impacts reality or world. You essentially become disconnected, right? And we want that connection because our students need that support and they need to be stronger than they are. So we want them to understand that knowledge, literacy is a tool, and literacy is a way through which we can access some of that knowledge, not all, because there are oral cultures and oral traditions and images and art and a lot of other ways of learning, right? But that reading and literacy is one way of accessing that knowledge, and that we teach them how to do that. We teach them when they need to access knowledge, how do they access knowledge, where do they access knowledge, what do they, how do they process and evaluate knowledge, and then how do they apply knowledge. If that is what we go for, that is knowledge as a resource rather than as a goal, then we are shifting the whole orientation of why we are engaged with education in the first place. It's for the betterment of our students' lives and the communities that they live in. And that is what is motivating. Students are motivated by doing things that will be good for them. They will enjoy it. They will benefit from it. Their parents and communities will be better off because of it. Those are the things that will engage them. And then literacy becomes a tool. Because remember, literacy is one aspect of one of our sensory systems. And as educators, that's if we only think of that, then we are actually unable, we are actually sort of not necessarily unable, we're actually perhaps compromising the overall goals of who an educator is and what the role of an educator is. And that education is more than just reading and writing, right? It's making a good educator enables their students to become independent and do things and be successful. And so if that's the goal, then we need to think about our teaching and learning cycles in a sense over a period of time, the duration of a student's life in your class or across your educational context, school, to achieve that independence over time. Remember, the teaching learning cycle is not a single thing. It keeps repeating itself. It's a recurring thing. And so as a student develops and your students develop, in a sense, your ways of engaging with the teaching learning cycle changes. But you still keep that cycle because that cycle will always help your students become enabled. Because through joint construction, they will all know what to do. And then when it comes time to the independent construction, they will be in a much stronger position to do that work. Right. So let's keep that in mind. So let's do it this way. So we have another session next Tuesday, but I know it's a different time zone and it won't work with you guys, which is fine. So and next week, in a sense, Susanna is going to be working on this set of activities with her students. So Susanna, if you could perhaps possibly, I know it's a stress, I don't want to stress you too much, but if you could perhaps take a day or two and just jot line an outline of what it is that you might want to do across the 2 weeks and what you might want to include, just links and things, and send that over to me by email. We'll work, and then I'll set up a time to discuss it with you. And then once we are happy, we will share it with the rest of the group and get their input. And then we will all be we'll be looking at what you're doing and seeing what's happening in your classroom. So in a sense, you're going to be our joint construction leader for this.
Oh gosh, thank you so much, Ahmar. I would love that. But let's see.
Yeah, let's work through it.
Let's,
And that's the best way of doing
Mhm.
it. Remember, so that's why we are doing joint construction. Is the only. This is something that's, remember. This is so important. Uh, how I don't know what sort of experiences you had as a student, and what sort of teaching philosophies you teach through, or what methods you're asked to teach through, or you were trained in. But one thing you would notice is that, it's regardless of what those are, you would have observed in yourselves that for some reason your own experiences as a student often overrule what you learn in your teaching methodology class. Why? Because it's our experience and our actions that are more important in our evaluating and thinking than what we read in a textbook. Just the same thing as other students do. So
yeah,
that's
but texts have changed me so much now,
absolutely,
so
absolutely, absolutely.
I'm a self-learner, so I needed to change the way I teach because the way I learned was so different, so individualistic.
Yeah.
I don't want it to affect my teaching. So I
Yes.
had to change. I had to
Yes.
evaluate.
That's, yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right, and that's exactly what we want to do, right? Progress along those track. So now we are sort of saying, okay, so yes, teachers, we can react to it. So certain things your teachers did, you would never want to do. Uh, but then you react to it, and then you might have other practices. But very often, if you actually look at it in distant and objectively, you will find that there are still mirrors. You're still mirroring it in certain ways, even though you are
Yes, I
reacting to
do.
it.
I
Um,
know.
and so now, how do we change that, right? Again, remember, it's the experience that is more important than just the reading. The readings are, of course, very important. That's why we read. We're not saying that literacy is not important. It's extremely important.
Mhm.
But it's the experience that sometimes overrides it, right? It's the experience of having that food that looks horrible and it smells shitty, and somebody telling you it's good, and you are not going to eat it, right? It's that experience, in a sense, that does that. So even though you're reading things, the reading filters through your experience in different ways. So that's why we're doing this joint construction here in this class, in this course too, because I want you to do this. I want you to work and develop these plans. And I want you to do this work with me, because doing it is what is going to make you understand it. Not just
I do believe that.
you're not just listening about it or reading it. So turning that into the actual material, and the actual application, that action of doing it is going to personally make you experience what we talk about. And of course, your personal experience might be different from what I might have, or Vivian might have, or others might have, which is absolutely fine, and which is
Mhm.
what we expect to happen. And that's why I keep saying that decolonizing education or pedagogy is, there's no one way of doing it. Each one of us will have to do it in a certainly different way, and it is sort of the goals that we are after, that is essentially kind of unifying us, not the actual realization. So that's good. Keep that in
Mhm.
keep that in mind, and then let's move from there. Wow, it's 10:42, longer than I thought. All right, any questions, last minute questions before we end this, and then continue through other channels?
No, I'm good.
All right, guys, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Vivian and Susanna, for participating in these conversations and discussions. And we'll work through Susanna. And again, the rest of you, I just want to stress it again. Please email me any questions, ideas that you have. I might not reply to emails right away, but I will
No, it's okay.
in time. If you want quicker response, then WhatsApp or other channels. Email is a bit slower. Anyway, thank you so much, everybody, and I'll see you around.
Thank you so much, Professor
Take care.
Ahmar.
Thank you.